Afternoon, everybody. Nice to see so many of you here. I assume most of you have come here to hear me speak and not because you've got lost looking for more free samples. But you're here either way, so you're going to be hearing me talk about what I think about the LGBTQ plus experience. Yeah, it's going to be a very, very personal talk. I'll warn you in advance. And I'm going to generally break it down to 3 sections. I'm going to start by talking about my own experience. Then I'm going to broaden out that concept to talk about LGBTQ plus experience in general, give a bit of a historical overview of some other queer experiences. Then I'm going to start bringing non-human persons into the picture, talk about otherization in general as a general concept. And then thirdly, I'm going to move on to talk about the animal movement itself and some of the dangers of letting otherization creep into our activism. Okay, I should start by warning you, because it's very personal, we're going to cover issues that are potentially triggering. We're going to be talking about suicide, self-harm. There's going to be talk about animal abuse and gay bashing. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, I think I can speak for everyone. I'm not going to judge you. No one is going to judge you if you want to put your headphones in or look the other way. If one of these issues is approaching, you will see a rainbow slide. And that means a potentially triggering subject is coming up. Do what you need to do to deal with it. You can probably even leave for a few minutes if you want to. Also, if any of you want to come up to me at the end and name any of the pictures that I've used for backgrounds, I'm quite a fan of JMW Turner. You'll get a free hug if you can name any of the paintings. Anyway, what do I want to say? Okay, yeah. I will say that what I'm not going to do is make any comparisons to LGBTQ plus experience, any direct comparisons. Quite often in the animal rights movement, we have this habit of making comparisons to previous injustices. So the Holocaust, the slave trade, those are things that spring to mind. And I'm going to say that there are reasons we make these comparisons. The reason should be compelling enough without having to make the direct comparison. I'm a history nerd. I've read lots of these articles, people comparing the meat industry to the Holocaust. They're fascinating. I'm not denying that. The clickbaity articles. But I don't personally think it's helpful. Now, I am vegan because I think causing unnecessary harm should be avoided. These comparisons, do they cause harm? I'm not sure. Are they necessary? No. People compare animal abuse to the Holocaust because it's government-subsidized, industrialized mass killing. That's compelling enough. Okay, are we all on the same page? That we'll kind of get where I'm coming from? Yeah, so you can see articles and YouTube videos, Holocaust survivors talking about this sort of thing. They have more of a kind of right to talk about it than I do. So I'm in a good position to make comparisons to the LGBTQ plus experience, and there aren't many comparisons to make, apart from the fact that I know how it feels to be seen as an other. Now, a little bit of my childhood. I grew up in a very middle-class kind of town, very white, a conservative stronghold in the suburbs of Bristol. My parents were heavily involved in the Church of England, so I grew up in that sort of community. And I should say here that none of my criticisms are against my direct family or my friends. For the most part, they were incredible. A lot of the people I talk about are the generic culture that I grew up in. And I very much accepted at an early age that I was different. And this sense of being different, this sense of if only they knew, they'd look at me very differently, that led to some very extreme forms of self-hatred. So self-harm, suicide attempts, been there, done that. And it's not pretty. You do internalize this feeling of being different. That's me in 2011. Iceland. That was our big family holiday. You know, when you're growing up, your family want to do one special holiday. And we did that. And that was during probably the worst time of my life. And you can see outside, I looked very happy. If you're looking to draw a comparison, this would be one of the free-range happy hens. But inside, very much feeling that I was another. And there's a sense of this that still continues today. I listen to an awful lot of music. Music's one of my passions. And earlier on the train, I was listening to a playlist. Queer artists sing about queer relationships. Just very powerful. Some of the songs you may recognise, probably not. Very few of these acts have made it into the mainstream, apart from perhaps with the exception of Bronski Beat. They're all niche acts. And this is often unnoticed. Unless you're a queer person, then you notice that all of these people they're singing about, these are straight relationships they're singing about. Unless you find these. Now I've kind of come to terms with my sexuality. I've hunted these artists down online, and I've found them, and I've been able to draw some strength from that. So, yeah, in terms of historically, putting it in its historical context. Oh, wait, one last picture. Yeah, growing up, instead of having songs on the radio to relate to, I very much more related to the Beatles. Hey, you've got to hide your love away, which I think many of us know. That fellow there, he can go vegan already. Thank you very much. So, yeah, that was my little bit of Beatles bashing. Yeah, historical context. This book was published by the National Lesbian and Gay Survey. Proust, Cole Porter, Michelangelo, Mark Almond and me, writings by gay men on their lives and lifestyles. A book title nearly as long as the title of this talk. And I want to get these quotes right. A man identified only as Tom, he wrote that, I can recall my parents talking about sissies, Nancy boys and mother's boys. My early perception of this was a sense that I was like these people. I should probably state that this was published in 1993. A bit of context. Michael expands on this theme of a formative encounter with his sexuality, saying, I would also have realised that what I actually had a name. This did not reassure me, though, for I did not want to be something that was treated with antipathy and abuse. And this is probably what leads Don to conclude, my first feelings about homosexuality was a strong urge to keep it secret forever. Now, a lot of these feelings in my story, certainly, they resonate today with a lot of LGBTQ plus people. I've spoken to a lot of LGBTQ people about these experiences. In fact, a couple of them I can see in the audience, and they generally can relate to this sense of coming to terms with their sexuality in a negative way, playground bullying, that sort of thing. Now, I've already said that, oh yeah, there we go, whoops. Yeah, these experiences are very different to what the animals experience. And I'd say that otherization is the least the animals have to worry about. And that was going to be the main thrust of my talk, was animals have it really bloody bad and humans are very, very privileged. And I was going to sit you down for an hour and tell you that I didn't really know anything, and that's about it. But then I started thinking, dairy cows who are repeatedly sexually abused, do they really care about otherization? Pigs that are waiting in line for the slaughterhouse workers' bolt gun, do they think about otherization? No, they don't. But what would happen if we did tackle otherization? What would happen if we actually went on to do something about it? And a bit of a side point, while I was writing that bit of the talk, that just who Word wanted to correct it to that. So that's an interesting grammatical point that even Microsoft Word still sees these animals as commodities. When I was typing that up, I couldn't not put that in my talk. It's not relevant in any way, but just that kind of comes in later as well. Now, Henry David Thoreau, many of you may know him, very interesting American writer. He said, "There 1,000 hacking at the branches of oppression to one who is striking at the root." And I think that that root may be very much closely tied to otherization. Now, what is oppression if not the physical manifestation of otherization? And what is otherization if not a state of mind? Now would be a good time to explain what otherization actually is. Kathleen Taylor, do any of you know her as a writer? She was a neuroscientist. And she wrote about Nazi persecution of the Jews during World War II. And she said that it was caused by them otherizing and otherizing Jewish people, and that caused them to commit horrendous atrocities. Now, we don't even need to go into what those atrocities were, but we can see that it's very much a very physical act coming from a very psychological issue, seeing people as other. And now in the LGBTQ plus experience, we have laws to protect us. We've got hate crimes legislation. That's brilliant. But awful things still do happen. Trigger warning coming up for some quite graphic pictures of violence and gay bashing. This was an article that caught my eye earlier in the year. I think it was around May in the Metro. These two people were beaten up a couple of minutes down the road from where I'm living at the moment in Brighton. Brighton is probably Britain's most gay-friendly city, supposedly. This was the gay district of the gay city, right outside a gay bar, where these people were beaten up essentially for being gay. So we've got this law, and still stuff like this happens. In another sense, I personally think it's acceptable to lie down in the road in front of a nuclear weapons factory and block the road. That seems like an acceptable thing to do. It's illegal, I should tell you, but still it's going to happen because I think it's acceptable. And in the same sense, things that we think acceptable to do to animals, we're going to do them because we think it's acceptable. Now, perhaps one of the most horrendous things I've seen on Facebook this year is a meme that seemed to perfectly channel violent transphobia with a glorification of animal abuse, sexual abuse, all sorts of horrendous things. So those who don't want to see it will probably want to look away. But this was posted in response to the South Carolina bathroom bill. The general message being, if a trans person goes into the ladies' bathroom, you have a right to do all sorts of horrendous things. This is one of the things they use to castrate piglets. And that really shocked me. And I think the thing to note here is a linguistic point. You notice the word, well, essentially them. It's make them think twice. If we had this as make another person think twice, make another being with feelings think twice, then it's suddenly a lot less funny. Not that it's funny in the first place. And that's what we do. Sorry, I'm kind of lost. Where on earth am I? I've waffled. Okay. So yeah, it's that sense of humanizing the victim that stops us from victimizing them in the first place, when we recognize that they are agents with a sense of self and a sense of identity. Now, I don't know how many of you, I'm looking at the gay vegan men group over there. Some of you may know a film that came out quite a few years ago called The Laramie Project. It's a real tearjerker. If you ever feel like you need to cry in an evening, watch The Laramie Project. And there's a scene in there where it's theatre directors interviewing people in the wake of a homophobic hate crime. And they're interviewing a couple, and one of the couples says to the interviewer, well, I certainly don't approve of homosexuals, but I don't think anybody has a right to do what those two boys did. The interviewer quickly replies to them, well, where do you think that comes from? Where do you think that comes from, their hatred towards homosexuals? I think the answer's pretty obvious. If you're growing up in a society where you're not approving of certain people, then you're quickly going to think it's acceptable to do awful things to them. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work for organisations promoting disarmament and peaceful conflict resolution. That blockade at Burfield Atomic Weapons Establishment was just one example. And I do sometimes get in trouble for, during a talk, making a comparison with British state policy and calling it terrorism. But the dictionary definition of terrorism, I've got here, the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce, especially for political purposes. Now, I would ask anybody, how is this in any way different to what we've been doing in Fallujah or Afghanistan in the last 10 or 20 years? The difference is that the bombing of Fallujah was what we did. Terrorism, in other senses, what we would call terrorism, is what they do, the us and them dichotomy. Now, when I was growing up in this kind of church setting, I attended a lot of evangelical youth groups. Very interesting places. I got a lot of love in some of them, and not so much love in others, put it that way. And I realised that one of the things that very quickly came up wherever I was people talking about what I've termed the gay issue, which sounds like some questionable magazine, but I assure you it's not. And I found people very much wanting to talk about this. In the same way, if you're a vegan at a dinner party, very quickly people start talking to you about your quirky diet. If you're in an evangelical youth group, you don't really need to say anything, and eventually, I found at least, people would start talking about the gay issue. Now, at this time, I wasn't out of the closet, and I would stay silent. I learned a lot about silence during this time. And when people started saying awful things, and you didn't say anything, they'd sense there was a comfort to say worse and worse, and to let their true inside feelings show, and to kind of encourage each other. And it got quite ugly in some situations. Some of the things that were said, I don't really want to go into it, but yeah, it reminded me in later life of a man called Harvey Milk. Again, somebody that the gay vegan men will probably know the name of. He was one of the first kind of openly gay elected public officials in America. And there he is. He famously instructed all of his colleagues to come out. He said, if you're gay and you haven't come out yet, come out. Now, it's questionable whether it's right to ever force somebody out of the closet. I think it is something that you need to do in your own time. But it was very much a sense of letting people know. What did he say? He said, you've got to let people know that we're their friends, their family, their employers, their employees. Now, I've said that there's this very much this difference, and that's one of the issues. Those with feathers and fins, they can't speak for themselves. They can't let people know. Even though it's obvious that non-human animals are all around us, they can't speak for themselves. They need somebody to speak for them. And we've got to speak for them, but we've got to do it carefully. Which brings me on to part 3 of my talk. Authorization within the animal community. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about authorization within the animal movement? Well, I'm talking about halal meat, Yulin Dog Meat Festival, these things that we say are awful. But actually what we're doing here is we're simply promoting authorization. What is halal other than animal abuse done by them and not by us? A good example, The Sun newspaper, when they were talking about the process of halal meat, it famously wrote that halal chickens must be alive when they are slaughtered. Now, I have this wonderful mental image of people reading this and thinking, no, alive when they're slaughtered? How barbaric. How awful. And, of course, the injustice should be in the act of slaughter, not the identity of the slaughterer or of the slaughtered, not in the way they're slaughtered. The act that you are slaughtering animals is barbaric and unnecessary. And that's it. There are no distinctions. Same thing with Yulin Dog Meat Festival. A lot of the propaganda I see about that is vehemently anti-Chinese. And that's something that's worrying. Now, historical authorization within the gay community is something that we've had to deal with. There's an artist called Zahid Dar, and he wrote in the book Walking After Midnight about a couple of racist incidents that occurred in a pub in King's Cross in 1983. Pub became infiltrated with neo-Nazis and horrendous acts of racism occurred. And it was managed very, very poorly. But I think shortly after that, the gay community started to learn, at least in parts, that one of the greatest things you can do is act in solidarity. One of my personal heroes is Mark Ashton. He was a gay rights activist in the 1980s. And if you watch the film Pride, he features quite heavily in that. And he managed to, not single-handedly, but played a big role in galvanizing union support for gay rights. Now, there was originally quite a bit of homophobia within the working class at the time. LGBTQ plus people were seen as too bourgeois to be radical. Of course, this is a huge generalization, but that was a general consensus. And he started saying, actually, you know what? Calling out the working class for their homophobia isn't, of course, we've got to call out everybody, but what we need to do is we need to realize that they've got their own struggles. And we've got to help them in their struggles and realize that then they're going to help us in ours, which is what he did during the miners' strike. And they found the common enemy of Margaret Thatcher, which I won't go into. And in the same way, we've got to realize that all forms of animal abuse are unjust. And we've got to not let that divide our communities. We've got to stand together with all of the oppressed communities locally, whether they be LGBTQ+, whether they be Muslim or Chinese or whatever, any other community, if they're facing oppression, we unite with them. We don't have to compromise our vegan message at all, but we've got to realize that all of the animal abuse is unjust. Okay. Now, I hope that you can see that so much of the pain that I've personally experienced is the result of otherization, and so much of the pain that non-human animals experience is similarly the result of otherization. So by reinforcing these dichotomies of us and them, we're not really aiding the deconstruction of an otherizing world. And I want to echo the words of Bayard Rustin. another one of my early heroes. And he said, if we desire a society of peace, then we cannot achieve such... Well, you can read it for yourself. It goes on. But I would add to this that if we desire to live in a world of unity, then we will not get there by otherisation. The means have got to match the ends. Okay? And how do we get there? This is me kind of coming into land, so we'll probably have time for a little Q&A at the end. I'm going to go way back. I've kind of been very focused in the 20th century, so I think it's probably time for a little 16th century French writer called Etienne della Boite. He said, "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break into pieces." A beautiful, beautiful piece of writing there. Very poetic, but the essence remains. If you take away somebody's support, then they're going to fall over because you're the ones supporting him. And in terms of dictators, it usually is a him. That's a point that Etienne della Boite wrote about. And this echoes conventional military wisdom. From Sun Tzu to Karl von Clausewitz, military theorists have generally recognised that if you want to overthrow an operation, you attack them where they're most vulnerable. One of the most prominent writers of this in non-violent terms is Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp wrote some great books, From Dictatorship to Democracy, The Politics of Non-Violent Action, Waging Non-Violent Struggle. My one take-home point would be, if you're an activist for any cause, vegan, human rights, read Gene Sharp's books. They are excellent. Some of them are very big, but they're wonderful. And his general theory was that you've got to assess the structure that you want to overthrow, find out where it's vulnerable, find out how you're supporting that in some way, withdraw your support, or find another way of stopping that support getting there. So, in the gay rights movement, they realised that the things supporting structures of homophobia were education, propaganda, media coverage, those sorts of issues. So you had people like the Gay Liberation Front and the American Gay Activist Alliance staging what they call ZAPs. Now, these were often theatrical, creative, disruptive displays, highlighting the absurdity of the opponent's arguments. So they do mimicry and caricature, the kissing protest, public smoking of cannabis sometimes, things like that, just to disrupt, to get the media attention. Because I realised the media attention was the thing that was supporting homophobia. That's the thing that would destroy homophobia if they could get in the way of that. Now, so they succeeded because they matched the action to the structure they were overthrowing. Now, in the arms trade, now I'm not an arms buyer, so I'm not financially supporting the arms trade. But what I can do is I can disrupt the silent complicity of the public. I can attend protests, draw attention to some of the dodgy British arms deals, and then I can disrupt the financial structures in other ways. So I can attend a blockade to close a factory for a day, incurring financial losses. I can incur greater financial losses if I do that at an arms fair. That's great fun. Actually, one of the main organisers of Stop the Arms Fair is here today. I just bumped into her. We had a little catch-up. Get involved in that campaign. It's great and teaches you a lot about direct action. And yeah, so I realised that that's an industry, it needs financial support. I can disrupt that financial support in certain creative ways. Now, animal exploitation. That's an industry too. Simply, the way we're going to disrupt it is by withdrawing our support. We presumably all know this because we're at a vegan kind of festival. And the difference is that when we're withdrawing financial support, and that's our only means of action, we need to gain the maximum participation in that struggle for it to be effective. Some disrupting arms fair stuff. That's me there. Hello. And that's a black screen. Oh, the end of slideshow. So, yes, in domestic and international law, we are as responsible for crimes we commission as we are for crimes we commit. So in moral terms, that also follows through, presumably. We've got to tell the public that if they are funding animal abuse, then they are complicit in it. If we recognise it to be evil, we need to withdraw our support. So at the end of the day, if we are to tackle the otherisation of animal abuse, we've got to engage in non-violent, abolitionist, vegan education. We've got to tell the public what they're supporting, why it's wrong, and what they can do about it. And that is essentially withdraw your support. Thank you. That's about all I have to say.